Hey there gardeners, Chris here. I wanted to cover some basic mistakes that I've made or I'm in the process of making with my garden beds so that you can avoid them. The very first of those is actually bowing garden beds, which as you'll see behind me here, I have got a Birdie's garden kit, and essentially speaking, I've run it in the thinnest but the longest configuration, and I just filled it today. I just put it in the ground and I've noticed that I was getting some bowing, and so I've knocked this basically piece of pipe in to help give it a little bit of support on the downhill side of things. It might even be necessary to add another support on this side or even on the other side, because the middle was bowing quite significantly, and I really haven't had that as an issue in any of my smaller Birdie's garden beds like this. And by smaller I mean the 370 tall garden beds. So that is something to keep an eye out for. In the bigger garden beds and in some of the other options available on the market, they have a reinforcement even through the smaller beds, and that does kind of make that less of an issue. But in this situation here, I've definitely got a bit of a bowing issue. Now, the other thing that I do think that I may have messed up here is I dug the garden bed into the ground, but I perhaps didn't really take the time to get it flat enough. And I do think getting your beds flat, if there's any kind of incline or uneven ground, is going to help, because it's going to help prevent erosion, which is quite an issue, where basically the water that comes through the bed might wash your soil away. And also it just makes it a little bit easier to access the garden bed rather than having it on a bit of an angle or the bed kind of twisted on the ground or anything like that, which is something I did really badly with my little miniature nectarine. And on this garden bed, I think it may be a little bit of an issue, and it may be contributing to the bed bowing a little bit, just because it's not sitting nice and flat, and as a result I would imagine the panels are just a little bit bent. So spend the time to get your garden beds nice and flat and well grounded, and you're going to be happy in the long term. If you're someone who's very detail orientated and you're going to look at something that's just not at quite the right angle or something like that, I'd spend even more time in measuring out all the gaps between your garden beds and things like that. I'm a little bit more chaotic, so I'm not quite so worried about that. I normally do a very rough measure, but for some people that is a really, really big issue, and it will really bug them. And once you've got a garden bed in, like this one is, you don't want to be moving it, you don't want to be emptying it, you don't want to be correcting your mistakes afterwards. Now, to be honest, I wasn't even going to cover my little miniature nectarine here, which this garden bed that it's in is by no means flat on the ground, which is an issue. However, the bigger problem with this one is that these beds, these are a little garden surround, or tree surround I should say, or a little herb garden, and for herb gardens they work well. I've got some raspberries growing in them and thornless blackberries growing in them as a little bit of a containment factor. They work well for that. The soil here is really poor, and as a result there's not enough soil depth for this tree to grow very well, and that is hurting the tree. I should have gone for a deeper and larger garden bed for this particular option, and I would have got better results. So not only is it not nice and flat, but it's probably not the best choice for this particular tree, and it's something that I could definitely improve upon. So don't make my mistake. A deeper garden bed would have cost quite a bit more, but for a long-term tree like a fruit tree, it just makes sense. What's going on here, I hear you say? It looks like a construction zone. That is pretty true. Basically, these garden beds behind me are really, really cheap $28 garden beds from Bunnings. They were the first garden beds I put in. I didn't have great soil. I made a lot of mistakes with them. But with things like soil, I could fix that mistakes. What I can't fix as easily now is that I've got these big gaps between each of these garden beds, which I think are maybe like 600 deep or 600 wide, and that's 2 foot. Basically, the reason that's an issue is because I thought to myself, I'm going to be smart, I'll space them, I'll get my mower between them. The reality is the grass is all going to be replaced eventually by wood chip, but in the short term, I don't need the gap. I could have had one continuous row of garden beds. I could have fit at least one more garden bed in. Maybe I could have squeezed in 2, which would have added at least 1.2 meters of extra garden bed, or perhaps 2.4 meters worth. Or if I'd wanted to be really creative, because these are 1200 wide and 900 long, I could have perhaps squeezed a 900 long in one and had a bit of an unusual kind of shaped garden bed, but I would have added quite a significant amount of extra growing room, which I would say is quite important. Now, what I've done is I've gone and bought an extra kit, and I'm hoping I can basically just screw these panels in quite easily. I'm just going to use some metal screws, and I'm going to do a pretty bodge job. But if I can do that, I will fill the gap here, one more down there, and then another one down the end, which will net me 3 extra bits of garden bed. And even if I just use it for flowers to bring in beneficial insects, it's going to be a real addition to the garden, a really valuable bit of space where, because I am in some ways limited on space, I needed to consider that a little bit more when I thought about putting these garden beds in. As a beginner gardener, I massively underestimated how much space I'd want or need, particularly if I want to be growing enough food to be really buying very little from the supermarket. And while I'm nowhere near there now, with that being a goal, I need to have a lot more garden bed space. I'm not even considering this a mistake, but it is something you need to be very, very careful of, because I think it's going to be a mistake which will hurt more than most other vegetable related mistakes. I've got my asparagus in this bed. It is essentially a crop which is going to last for 10, 20 years. And while it's not impossible to move the crowns in the down season when it's all dormant, it would be a big job, and hopefully you don't have to do it. What you want to do is you want to pick a location where they're going to be for essentially forever, and just leave them there. I think this was actually a pretty decent choice of spot. It gets good sunlight. It's not too shaded by the tree. It gets a good amount of rain as well. It's just a nice kind of middle of the road spot, which is perfect for my asparagus. And I'm even going to probably put in a little rhubarb, because I have heard that that is another perennial that is a companion plant for my asparagus, so I'm going to give that a try. In the little corner I've got free, which did have tomatoes in it originally, but when you're talking about a perennial plant, it's way more important that you pick the right spot, because you don't really want to move it. Your garden bed orientation is really, really important. Now, I'm on an incline, and the general rule is you run your garden beds across your hill. Now, generally, you actually orientate them for maximum sun, so that the sun travels across your garden beds, which gives you the best distribution of sunlight and less shadowing. However, on a hilly terrain, you run it across your hill, and actually one of the good things about being on a hill is the elevation change, particularly if it's quite steep, does mean that it kind of can counteract the amount of sun you're getting. But again, obviously you don't want to be on the shadowed side of a hill with your garden beds, because that's probably not going to work for a lot of your vegetables. This bed here is running down the hill, which this was just a fun, cheap bed that I added in. It's got a pepino growing in it, which is going amazingly well. It's got a little kiwi berry down the other end that is either dormant for winter or dead. And even the strawberries in this bed have really struggled, and it is under a macadamia tree. So it's not an ideal location. It's not a very serious bed. I've broken all the rules, had some success, but I think if you do break all the rules like I have here, expect some disappointments, and you're really going to have to figure out what's going to work. The erosion side of things, of having the bed going downhill, have not been an issue, so that is good. But again, I'm not sure that I'd really recommend it as anything except for a bit of a fun kind of experiment if you've just got an extra garden bed, which I did here.